Andrew Jackson is going to be the next person featured in the Made America 250 series, where I highlight people, places, and projects that made America the 250-year-old social entity that it is. Though there may be occasional people, places, projects, happenings, in kind timeline that make me think, let me jump and put something in this, I'm going to be going decade by decade. I will eventually actually break down decade by decade for the United States of America, start from 1776 all the way to 2026 when they celebrated the 250th anniversary. And for this one, we are up to 1826 until 1836. So there was other things happening as well. I mean, we just come from the Erie Canal Project, so the United States of America was now together, one nation, indivisible under God, different states coming together. Now there was big federal projects and things like that coming through. There was things like the Missouri Compromise, which was a legislative deal that attempted to balance slave and free states by drawing a line across the territory, saying, okay, this is where it's going to end. The North didn't want it to expand. Of course, the South wanted to expand. And that's going to be something that will be highlighted in the individual we talk about today. But before we get back to that, there's also John Quincy Adams, who I think was a significant enough person, considering was he going to be the person, but I think this other thing is more important that I want to focus on this. But he was the sixth president of the United States of America. He was a long-term bureaucrat. He was also the first person to be the first son to be the first son of a former U.S. president to also become a president himself. And his dad was John Adams, who was the second president of the United States of America. And that didn't happen again until, you guessed it, you might have guessed it, 176 years later with George W. Bush, who was the son of George Herbert Walker Bush. So yeah, that's kind of interesting to happen with that. I took the oath of office. He departed from tradition by placing his hand on a book of constitutional law instead of the Bible. And in his inaugural address, he adopted a post-partisan tone, promising to avoid party building and politically motivated appointments. So with some of this, I've been talking about how I think America is one of the first post-myth nations, post-myth great nations, societies, cultures, because it's been invented, it's lasted for long, and with the countries and nations that happened before, and some of the countries and nations that track their history to far before this, the part of the reason they said that happened, that maintenance happened, was because the gods had given them the blessing to be that long lasting. Because for most of history, most of the social organisms, just like most of the biological organisms, most of the mimetic organisms, just by the nature of life itself, it's fleeting. Most of the ones that have come up have died off, have disappeared. And to have that long-lasting ability, 250 years is pretty long. I guess it's long enough. You have some places like China, let me double check. Okay, so China as a continuous civilization is approximately 3,600 years old. If you're talking about unified imperial state, it's about 2,244 years old. That's beginning in 221 BC. And then as a modern people's republic, that's 75 years old, established on October 1st, 1949. And then I think the longest, they're saying maybe the longest, like say some scholars and recent genomic studies also argue that the indigenous Australians represent the world's oldest continuous living culture with evidence of habitation and cultural continuity dating back 65,000 years. However, this is categorized as continuous culture rather than a civilization in the traditional sense of urbanized state level societies with writing systems. And I think there are certain differences with those things, because if you're just arguing, oh, we all came from the initial thing, then somehow, how does a culture get established in a different place? And okay, so this one is both like the American culture. When did it switch from just being European immigrants and creating an American culture? When did the American culture supplant the natives that were there before, the people that had been there when they crossed over, I think, the Bering Sea? But they're like, those people crossed over, I think, when it was frozen and they came over. When did they establish now an North American continent that was different from the culture that they left because they migrated from somebody else way back then? And was that full on thing? Would that end? Was it a nationwide or continental wide sort of thing? So there's all these arguments of what happened to this, when does something transition into something else, and that is also something we'll be discussing here in this part of why I wanted to focus on Andrew Jackson, was something particular about that transitioning, about the culture about social organisms, about how long does something be this, when is something created, when is it transfer into something else. And that's also part of what I'm trying to suss out with this Made America 250 series. Is it what was created at the start? Has it turned out to be something else? If there's positive things, what are the positive things? And what are the things that should be continued? What is the difference between the American dream / nightmare versus the American reality? And how are the changes since the start to where we are today, and what can possibly come in the future? Now for reading about the 8th President of the United States of America, Andrew Jackson, and the Jacksonian democracy era movement that he ushered in from the White House Historical Association. Andrew Jackson was born on March 15, 1767, near Lancaster, South Carolina, to a family of Scotch-Irish immigrants. His father, Andrew, passed away just a few weeks before his son's birth. All 3 Jackson boys, Hugh, Robert, and Andrew, were raised by their mother, Elizabeth. The family settled in the Waxhaws near the North and South Carolina border, where they joined a large community of Scots-Irish farmers. Why was it Scotch-Irish before then Scots-Irish farmers here? English language is odd that way. At age 13, Andrew joined his older brothers in the fight against the British as the Revolutionary War raged in the Carolinas. Both Hugh and Robert died as a result of the conflict, and Andrew was left with a scar on his head from a British officer's sword and a deep hatred for redcoats. After the war, Jackson moved to North Carolina, where he studied law with several prominent lawyers. As white settlers pushed westward, new territories and opportunities emerged for Jackson. He served as a district attorney and later practiced law throughout Tennessee before settling in Nashville. In 1802, he was elected general of the Tennessee militia, serving in different theaters as needed. In 1812, President James Madison commissioned him Major General of the U.S. Volunteers, and he led military campaigns against the Creek Nation. With their defeat, Jackson imposed treaties with the Creeks, Choctaws, Chickasaws, and Cherokees, securing millions of acres of land for white settlers. He was later called upon to wage war against the Seminoles. Jackson's interpretation of his orders resulted in the invasion of Spanish Florida, and in 1819, Spain ceded the territory to the United States. Despite winning the popular vote in 1824, Jackson lost the election in the House of Representatives to supporters of Henry Clay, who voted for John Quincy Adams. You can see already there was these things like, hey, you just win the popular vote. That was already an issue way back then. And then later on, was that the hanging Chad with the other son who tried to run president, but then he actually ended up winning because of the everything with going against Al Gore. Anyway, back to this. Jackson, who advocated for the common man, was denounced corruption in the government, ran again in 1828. The campaign was particularly ugly, as Adams's supporters accused Jackson of executing troops unlawfully, illegally invading Florida, and engaging in innumerable brawls and duels. I don't know if I kind of would improve if you had actually that were physically in brawls and duels instead of just meet you behind. What was he? I didn't say I'll meet you behind the bleachers or something. Anyway, so that was already in there. They also dragged Jackson's wife, Rachel, into the fray, labeling her a bigamist. And that's somebody who gets married when they're already married. So I don't know about all that. Yeah, stuff was going down. Despite these attacks, Jackson defeated Adams, but Rachel died at Hermitage before he left for Washington. Jackson believed the campaign contributed to her death, and he never forgave his political enemies. Although they never had children, they treated Rachel's nephews, Andrew Jackson Jr. and Andrew Jackson Donaldson, like sons. Their daughters-in-law, Sarah York Jackson and Emily Donaldson, also served as White House hostesses during Jackson's presidency. While Jackson was not very vocal about slavery, he was a prominent slave owner for most of his life. And this is kind of the thing that maybe select this in the thing coming up because of something going on in current timeline. Okay, so as I said, he was a prominent slave owner in most of his life. He brought enslaved people from the Hermitage to work at the White House, and he continued to purchase enslaved people while he was president of the United States. Jackson respected the right of individuals to own property and had no moral qualms when it came to profiting from slavery. At the same time, he viewed pro-slavery fanatics and abolitionists negatively. blaming both groups for instigating sectional discord. His support of the gag rule and the suppression of abolitionist literature reflected his acceptance of slavery and general opposition to anything he perceived as a threat to the Union. This same mentality guided his reaction to the nullification crisis in 1832, as Jackson was eager and willing to force South Carolina to comply with federal laws over the tariffs. And as here it says, click here to learn more about enslaved households of President Andrew Jackson. We'll come back to that. But just a bit on what was said there. Like, so he had the mentality, he had that middle way. Let's just be a centrist. Don't be an abolitionist. Don't be so pro-slavery. Just keep the things the way they are. And yeah, I'm going to profit from that while being president. And there's accurately people criticizing what Trump is doing right now. Like, what is he doing with you get the truth post milliseconds before? What is he doing with this? Like, oh, I'm going to bomb Iran. Oh, and the weekend comes. Oh, no, actually, it's going to be okay. Yeah, we know billions of people are getting insider trading-ish sort of stuff, allegedly. I don't know what kind of indemnified, how can get indemnified from that, from the things that are going on. There's shenanigans galore going on. There's been insider trading. There's been a whole thing where people come in and become wealthy in many different ways, and people are accurately disgusted by that. They should also just be disgusted even just by the entire system itself. It's coercion and taking money away from people and then giving it to other people, and they're inflating cash by just printing money. So there's things over there, but people get to a certain point where like, I'm not going to accept this. The regular type of stuff you do, okay, you go ahead and do that. Hunter Biden, Burisma stuff, you can do that in a different. 10% for the big guy, we're going to look a different other way. But what Trump is doing is in a different level. And I will admit, some of the stuff Trump is doing is in a different level. That's also because of current timeline, because of different things you can possibly do, like right now, Bitcoin and that kind of stuff, cryptocurrency and those kind of schemes. Many other ways have been discovered and invented to generate wealth. And I think if some of these things existed in the past, I don't think we had such uniquely moral and ethical presidents that they wouldn't have also attempted to get away with some of the things that Trump is doing today. I don't think he's like uniquely predisposed in that kind of sense. Just like back then, there was slavery, and Andrew Jackson was not the first president to own slaves, was not the last president to own slaves, but he was one who was like, I'm actually going to actively profit from it even more. And it's safe to say that him being president of the United States of America probably gave him some ability to profit more over slavery than he would if he was just Joe Schmo business person, slave owner from the South. Okay. Back to this. Jackson vowed to make government work for the common man, chastising officials and institutions that threatened Republican ideals. He attacked the political patronage system, arguing that appointments should be based on merit, though he himself tended to reward his supporters and offices and positions in the government. He vetoed the renewal of the charter of the Second Bank of the United States, rebuking it as a government-backed monopoly that only favored the wealthy. He also signed the Indian Removal Act of 1830 and forced dozens of unfair treaties on the Native American peoples. President Jackson maintained that removal was the best solution for all parties, as it would preserve Indian cultures, prevent unwanted assimilation, and limit violence between white settlers and Native Americans. Best intentions aside, this devastating relocation resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands of indigenous peoples as they were forcibly pushed westward by the military. After the presidency, Jackson returned to Tennessee and spent his remaining years organizing his papers as well as managing his plantation. On June 8th, 1845, he died at the Hermitage. So this was a man who vowed to make government work for the common man. He was against the Second Bank of the United States because he said it was a monopoly that was only favoring the wealthy. If I told you this man who was a populist, he was chastising officials and institutions that threatened the Republican ideals, with small r, what party currently existing do you think this man founded, if you don't know already? It was the Democratic Party, and that came from the fractured Democratic-Republican Party in the late 1820s, and then his allies and friends like Martin Van Buren, who was a vice president, and then he was next president, followed him up. They helped actually write the charter and establish it as an official political party. And that party was formally named the Democratic Party in 1832 and became the nation's first well organized national political party under Jackson's presidency. So, in current timeline, there's people who have been saying we need to take the names off of this, we need to not participate in this, because in the past, these were people who were slave owners. And as I mentioned with Andrew Jackson, he not only just inherited slaves like the previous slave owning presidents, he was actively engaged in slave trade while he was president in office, while he was also creating the Democratic Party of today, which is the side that's like, we need to not support that. We need to take that name out of there. We need to not be affiliated with this organization because of the past history of slavery. We're not going to inherit that negative nation. I feel like I'm inheriting some sort of taint from doing that. But there was the party switching, which we'll talk about. Which was the thing, I was like, did the parties actually switch? So we're going to get into that. But there's some things with the party switching here. There's also this part that's here that President Jackson maintained that removal is the best solution for all parties, as it would preserve Indian cultures, prevent unwanted assimilation, and limit violence between white settlers and Native Americans. And that gets me thinking of certain things I see going on in current timeline. Who is bringing back segregation? And what is the end result of spaces for X people? We need to have these people have their own areas. These people have their own spaces. We need to have universities have Black graduations. We need Latinx dorms and things like that. What does that end up doing? That ends up getting these immigrants, minorities, and these other groups segregated away from the white groups. You don't have to learn about each other. You have your thing that way. You have your space in that kind of way. So that's something that I think a lot of people in the Democratic Party are still holding. Some of the party switching, which comes to the people who are saying the KKK was Democrat, the people who were slave owners in the South were Democrat, and then there's a claim that there eventually was some party switching. And there's going to be links wherever I post this. You can go and find the Rantathon blog that's going to be going on this, where I'm going to be reading some things from different people who just cover this question of, did they actually switch? And first, I'm going to be reading from Fact/Myth. And this one is, did the Democrats and Republicans switch parties? So you'll be able to check that out. I think this website has a lot of other facts and myths. So it's the kind of website that is right in my alley that I'll probably be checking some more things out on. So here we go. Did the Democrats and Republicans switch parties? The U.S. political parties, now called Democrats and Republicans, switched platform planks, ideologies, and members many times in American history. These switches were typically spurred on by major legislative changes and events such as the Civil War in the 1860s and civil rights in the 1960s. These changes then unfolded over the course of decades to create what historians call the party system. It says, bottom line and clarity on the semantics of the term switch. Yeah, this is right down my alley, getting into semantics. So the party switched over time as platforms, parties, and things. It said examples like you can, although what happened is complex, in many cases there was no clean, sudden shift, and the voter bases and factions never switched. You can see evidence, so it's no clean, sudden shift, and some voter bases and factions never switched. So some people have stayed back in it. Like I think in current timeline, the neocons were now on the political right, were recently just voting for Democrats on the political left. And that's something that is not really discussed that much. I've seen a few people discuss it, but not really so much on like the mainstream media. So you have voter bases switching. They're saying you can look at where congressional seats were. So United States Congress under Trump, and then the 71st United States Congress under Hoover was one of the examples you can said. You can go to historic party platforms. So some of these links, there's a lot of links into this one, but what I wanted to read from this was an overview of the party system. So the party systems, also known as eras of the United States political parties, can be described as follows, where the main things that switch in each party system are key factions, party leaders, geographical voter bases, and specific planks of party platforms. So the first party system, the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists. To the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans, to the era of good feelings, where both parties switch to become the one-party Democratic Republicans. This ends with Jackson versus Adams, where the parties switch back to a two-party system. In this system, the Anti-Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, who essentially go on to become the Democratic Party in the second party system, are the small government party favored in the South, while the Federalists, who will essentially become National Republicans, and then the Whigs in the next party system before becoming Republicans, Are the aristocratic big government party favored in the North? Now you can see that's definitely different. Like the wealthier people up in the north, the more in the coast, are more towards the Democrats, and then you can see the South, those kind of people who want small governments are definitely more towards the Republicans. At least ostensibly, the government still keeps going because that's the nature of the thing, regardless of what was put in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. So the second party system, the Jacksonian Democrats versus the National Republicans Whigs, to expansion and to expansion to the dissolution of the Whigs. This ends with the tension over states' rights before the formation of the Republicans, Lincoln's election, and the Civil War. The tensions break the two parties into a number of factions, some of which take their single voter issue party planks with them, like Know Nothings or Free Soilers. But the general two-party system and the ideologies of the parties is otherwise retained. This is what I'm thinking is happening right now. You have the Democratic Socialists rising. You have libertarianish sort of people like Thomas Massey. You have Senator Rand Paul, who are pretty much libertarians, but they completely understand we have to run this. You have people like Trump, who he's not a Republican or a Democrat. He's just he's a Trump. He's MAGA. You have the MAGA party. You have America First. I think what we're having right now, I'll be very surprised if you still have the Democratic and Republican Party that can trace its roots to the first and second party systems still existing in a few more. How many more? I'm thinking, yeah. Even it's 24 more years, that's how many more terms? That's if you have 8-term presidents. I don't even think we'll be having 8-term presidents. I think you'll be jumping back and forth. And I think those parties are going to be gone because you're going to have other people come in and start taking control of significant smaller areas, and then they coalesce together. And then you have maybe something more like in Europe where you have coalitions of parties coming together to form governments, because you're going to have certain places where so many people of certain mindsets have coalesced. Like you look at the New York City sort of thing, where you just have a different mentality than most of the other country, where they can't get a national platform going, but they have enough people in a limited area in significant places to have a lot of control and influence over national politics. And I think you'll start seeing something like that happening in the United States of America. Okay, the third party system. Know Nothings, Free Spoilers, and Southern Democrats, Northern Republicans, Radical, Moderate, and Conservative, the Populist Party, and many other factions who switched from the major parties to third parties over issues surrounding slavery. During the second and third party systems, from Bleeding Kansas to the Civil War to Reconstruction and to the Bourbon liberals switch into the Democratic Party, to the Gilded Age where both parties became pro-business and in which there's an influx of immigration, which changes the often pro-immigrant Democratic Party. That's kind of interesting right there. So you said change them, and then now the Democratic Party is way more pro-immigrant, even though there's changes in immigration. The influx is coming in, and that's actually being spurred by the Democratic Party. This ends with the rise of progressivism, which is not that new of a thing. I think what's going on right now is more accurately called regressivism. That's what I call them, regressives. And regressives on the political left, right, and center. It's not just one party or the other. Where the Democrats begin to become increasingly progressives under the figures like Bryan, despite their conservative factions. Who is this Bryan here? Bryan William Jennings? Bryan Williams Jennings Bryan, father of the modern American populism. Okay. The factions of this era are notable as they help illustrate the different factions that switch parties and cause platform planks and much else to switch over time. The fourth party system, the rise of progressivism in the progressive era, where both parties embraced progressivism following the Gilded Age. To Teddy Roosevelt leaving the Republican Party, where progressive Republicans begin to switch to the Democratic Party, to the First World War, to Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, where the Republican platform starts to become less progressive and more pro-business. This ends with the rise of the New Deal coalition versus conservative coalition, two cross-party coalitions that are emblematic of the modern parties. This party system really sets the modern struggle of free enterprise, Gilded Age factions versus progressive era factions in motion. Especially with the rise of media, the events of the world wars, the Fed, that's the Federal Reserve, the income tax, voting rights, and the rise of the modern state. Most of the major switches of the modern era are a result of this tension. This tension also gives new meaning to big government and small government, as now we have to consider the welfare state. And I did mention how with the Eli Whitney thing, when they created he was creating something with the cotton gin, and that kind of went towards more like the welfare state sort of thing, with things that are happening with like slavery being the ultimate welfare state, because you have the people, you're controlling the health, you're controlling the shelter, you're controlling the jobs they have, you're controlling all the money that comes from them. That's complete full on leftist. And then now you had like his interchangeable parts being done in like the warfare state in the north. They were using that to build better weapons and start equipping the military industrial complex. So he kind of contributed, one person's inventions contributed to both of these things. So I think the welfare and warfare state was already beginning in that kind of sense. But this is something where they say it happened in an entirely different way here. Like now official bureaucratized version of it. Okay, starting in this era, the Great Migration begins, and this changes both parties by changing the location of future geographic voter base. And then once voting rights of 1965 happens. The fifth party system. From FDR to the New Deal coalition versus conservative coalition to the Second World War, and the global and national tension between fascism and communism. To the rise of states' rights parties. This ends with a battle at home after World War II over Brown versus the board, I think the Board of Education, Kennedy, civil rights in 1964, and voting rights in 1965 under LBJ, I think. Yeah, LBJ. And I thought that was a parenthesis. It wasn't. It was a J. Okay. And the rise of Goldwater Republicans in 1964, where the Solid South begins to switch from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party in response to not only LBJ's programs, but in response to the increasingly progressive Democratic Party and all the implications of that progressivism. Some, including me, feel that this is followed by the sixth party system. From LBJ and civil rights to me, not me speaking, but the person who's writing, from LBJ and the civil rights to the Southern realignment, aka Big Switch or Solid South Switch, where from 1964 to 2000, where the South switches to favoring the Republican Party, to Reagan or Clinton. This ends with the rise of modern fairness doctrine, doctrine-free media. Let's keep reading and see if he kind of parses that out. This might be just a semantics issue. Maybe that's like what it's told, but I don't know if that's actually been that way. He's talking about 1964. Yeah, I don't know. Reaganomics and the Clintons' third way neoliberalism, which had started with figures like Cleveland, Wilson, and Carter, and is a sort of Bourbon liberal mashup of classical liberalism, social liberalism, and conservatism focused on business interests and deregulation. Its counterpart in the Republican Party is called neoconservatism. Yeah, I think the neocons, okay, yeah, because maybe those people were there at the same time as Clinton and they were supported them and then eventually started switching over to that. Yeah, so maybe that's what is being referred to in that kind of sense there. But you can see this being shown how mostly people on the political right will post videos of Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton, other recent still alive Democrats on the stump during their actual terms saying stuff that is considered far right fascist, MAGA, hating of populists, hating of people, wanting grandmas to starve type of mentality now. But that was what the Democrats were in living memory, at least my middle-aged self. Like I was there when that stuff was happening. I was hearing some of that stuff when it was happening. Okay. The socially conservative and or small government identities we call paleocon, libertarian, and the religious right become more dominant in this area, which helped to increase the popularity of the Republican Party in the South with the aid of right-wing media and think tanks. Yeah, I do agree, like talk radio and things like that definitely did increase the spread of some of these ideas and support for certain political movements. Meanwhile, progressivism and neoliberalism came to dominate the Democratic Party as the Southern conservatives and either reform, like Robert Byrd, or shift to the Republican Party, like Strom Thurmond over time. Yeah, Robert Byrd. That was the West Virginia guy that was part of the KKK in some way and was like a mentor to. Was they like? Let me check. Yeah, this is part of this whole mixed nature of a post-myth sort of society. You have the good and the bad, people who say something's good and bad, and then they just kind of pretend it never happened, or it's a legend, or it's not a thing. But yeah, Robert Byrd served as a mentor to both Joseph Robinette Biden and one Hillary Clinton, who each described him as a close friend and guide during their early Senate careers. This is despite his early involvement in the Ku Klux Klan, where he recruited members and led a local chapter. So Byrd later renounced those views and evolved to become a staunch supporter of the civil rights legislation. So yeah, at least he said that outright. I'm not going to deem to know what's in the actual minds of some of these people. But yeah, this is the best we can do, is just deal with the stuff on the outside. So back to the reading from Fact and Myth, and this was written by, what was the name you were talking about here? Thomas de Michel. De Michele. Was it de Michele or de Michel? Okay, so back to the reading. So you were saying... Some, again, including de Michele, he said me, de Michele we're talking about here, then feel this is followed by a seventh party system from Reagan/Clinton to the subsequent polarization and rise of modern media, to the war in the Middle East, to ballots and modern debt, to Citizens United, to today. Does this end with Obama/Trump and figures like Bernie, or are we still in the seventh party? Only time will tell. One thing is clear, though. The Democrats are increasingly seen as an aristocratic party and are favored in urban centers and in the North, while the Republicans are seen as a populist small government party and are favored by rural areas and the South. A full switch from how it was back in the 1800s. This isn't to say everything switched, and this isn't to say that the party planks didn't evolve with the times. But this is to say the factions, voter bases, and planks that did switch had a considerable effect, going as far as to turn the rural small government party of yesterday into the urban big government party of today. So yeah, I definitely think you should check out. There's a lot more here. He has a subsection, the introduction to the history of major parties and the big switches. This isn't just about a solid South. Listen, looking for proof. So he's given a lot of evidence and a lot of things. So if this is something that's interesting to you and you want to have some discourse on this, don't just filth and just throw stuff out there. Just, the party switched when it's convenient. There's other aspects of switch. So there was positive things about the Democratic Party at the beginning that might have switched. Do you take away those things, or is it just the slavery that's the thing that we people want to focus on? And I'm not for one who you've inherited the sins of the father. It's a religious sort of mentality to think that you have that original sin because the people who did some bad things in the past now invented something that is still being used today for good. That taint does not continue in it in that sense. And the people who are today, who might not even know anything about those people that started before, why should I damn them for what somebody did in the past? It's a mentality that I don't really like. It comes from collectivism, it comes from religion, and those are two things I'm really just not that supportive of. But there's discourse to be had, there's information here, and this is one of the things I still really appreciate about the United States of America, that it has the ability for people to discuss these things out in the open. This whole idea that some of the things are being hidden and these parties are against it. Yeah, okay, so the party might be against it. People might want to say certain things in schools, but you're not limited to schools. You can go out and find this information. Even if you're in other countries, you can find this information. I'm recording this from Nairobi, Kenya. I have the interest in this, but people in the United States of America had enough interest in this, and they have studied and they have put it out. And the government isn't like shutting down these websites saying you can't talk about these things, you can't talk about those other things. There's other sources I saw where you can actually read more about this, like factually. I don't know if this is using some sort of algorithms to kind of get things together, because I see it was getting from the Fact and Myth story that I actually read from, the Atlanta magazine, The Great American Political Party Switch, The Great Switch, How Republicans Switched or something, the Students of Liberty, When Did Democrats and Republicans Switch, from Live Science. So it's getting from different sources. You can see the sources there. You can go follow it. You can do your own research yourself and actually get more information about some of these things yourself if you want to have these discussions. I went to Quora. There's also several answers. Did the Republicans and Democratic parties really switch? If so, when and how? Somebody said it's complicated, and it is complicated. Very few of things in life, including the post-myth nation of the United States of America, are clearly black and white. Very few things about the individuals that did start this nation that still exists, that has undoubtedly, objectively, some great parts about it, were great people all the way in themselves. So I'll come back to read now this. As I said, we'll come back to this. The Enslaved Household of the President Andrew Jackson. Now, this is the White House Historical Association. It's a .org. So I'm assuming this is actually like an official U.S. government thing. It's there. It's being told. The White House Historical Association is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization entrusted with preserving and sharing the history of the White House. So this is there. This is there. This is part of it. It doesn't shy away from this. There's many nations that had a lot of evil things happen in the founding of those nations, but they've been relegated to the dark side of history or mythicized out of being a thing or not being discussed today. And I think part of what makes America great in any possible way is the ability to discuss the negative parts about it and go away from, don't go into this point of this mythological sort of place where everything is good, where no matter what we do is good, whatever our dear leader does today is good. Don't do that whether you're in the political left or the political right. Be better than that. Be the people that actually could create the United States of America, that made America, and can make whatever America will be in the future. And whatever other people can learn from this, I think that's something to be encouraged. So let's read this from Andrew Jackson about Andrew Jackson. The Enslaved Household of the President Andrew Jackson by Kaylee Hopkins. In January 1829, less than 2 months before he became president, Andrew Jackson ordered an inventory of his slaves. The inventory recorded the names, ages, and familial relationships of 95 enslaved individuals who lived and worked at the Hermitage, his Tennessee plantation. When President-elect Jackson left for the White House, he brought some of those enslaved people with him. The 1830 census listed 14 enslaved individuals in the Jackson household, 8 women and 6 men, and many scholars suggested that this household grew during the course of his presidency. Jackson also made significant improvements to the White House during his administration, including the construction of the North Portico and the new stable, as well as the addition of running water to the house, projects that almost certainly made use of enslaved labor, either from Jackson's own household or hired from the other slave owners in Washington, D.C. Currently, there's some kerfuffle going on with this ballroom that Trump wants to build and whatever drone platform sort of thing he's building on top and the massive bunker he's building below and all these things. Oh, you got to get the permission from Congress to do this. You can't do this. It's a historical site. So what do you want to do? You want to preserve the additions that the slave owner built? Is that what you want to preserve? Was there things in there? So again, it's a mixed bag when you start dealing with some of these politics. So there's a picture here, enslaved household of President Jackson. So name, this was in 1832, George, 25, Charles, 38, Grace Bradley, 22, Louisa, 16, Emmeline, 8, Byron, 12, Jim, 9, Jesse, similar to Jim Byron, Adam, child, unknown. It was estimated based on records. Unlike some other slave-owning presidents, Jackson did not leave behind many public statements or writings on the morality of slavery. He never explicitly defended the institution, but he also never questioned it or displayed any qualms about his own role as a slave owner. The paternalistic ideal of slavery, common in this era, claimed that slave ownership was morally acceptable as long as the owners served as paternal figures, for their enslaved people, offering food, shelter, and other necessities. In managing his own human property, Jackson sought a balance between authority and kindness, punishment and forbearance. He fretted about whether one enslaved man's death might be produced by the ill treatment of the overseer, and insisted that those he hired to manage the farm treat my Negroes with humanity. This is the thing. The basic human needs. What are the basic human needs that people are demanding? This is a human right. It's a human right to be fed, to be sheltered, and be provided other necessities. And that's what a just government does. That's what a just welfare state does. And this person is saying, the slavery, as long as slavery is just, if you offer food, shelter, and other necessities, and you make sure that people are treated well, then you can still harvest all of their income, distribute to them as you see fit, not allow them to be independent individuals, as long as you're taking care of them, as long as you're paternalistic, you're looking out for them, and you're making sure the people who have power over them are also looking out for them, are doing it for their greater good. Continuing. There may have been genuine compassion behind this approach, but it was also a carefully calculated one. Relatively healthy and well-treated enslaved people were more likely to work hard and less likely to run away or revolt. Slavery was also the primary source of Jackson's personal wealth, and he wanted to protect his assets. When he wrote to Graves W. Steele, the overseer accused of causing an enslaved man's death at the Hermitage, he demanded a full account of your guardianship with the loss of my property. This choice of language suggests that he cared more about the financial impact of the death than he did about the man's life. Now, here, this might be a semantic situation. I think this might have been more of a business arrangement. Even if he did care somewhat about the life as much, he would say property in this sense because you're talking to somebody who was hired to, in that sense of a business sort of arrangement. Am I excusing the slavery? I'm excusing language? No, I'm kind of just explaining how I might care about something in a certain personal way, but if I'm doing it, discussing that one thing in a more business sort of arrangement, I'd talk about it in a different way. Now there's a picture here of the Hermitage. Enslaved families would have lived in cabins like this one. So there's a cabin there. Was there anything else I wanted to say about this one? So yeah, again, the genuine compassion behind this approach. I don't care about the compassion that the people on the left say they have when they're bringing back segregation, when they're increasing the welfare state. Was it compassionate what Fauci was doing? When he was like, I want to make sure the people who have masks, who really need the masks, have the masks. Was that compassionate? Was it compassionate when he was funding we need to make sure in case anybody develops this that we have the cure for it? Was that compassion? So when it comes down to compassion, it's not the deciding factor. Like many slave owners, President Jackson did not always live up to his stated ideals. He ordered harsh, even brutal punishment for enslaved people who disobeyed orders. When an enslaved woman named Betty was judged to be guilty of some improper conduct, he wrote to his overseer that she must be ruled with the cowhide and should be given 50 lashes the next time she misbehaved. When an enslaved man ran away from the Hermitage, the punishment was even more extreme. He put an advertisement in the Tennessee Gazette that promised a reward for the man's return, and $10 extra for every 100 lashes any person will give him, to the amount of 300, which would almost certainly have killed the runaway man. More importantly, even when Jackson did live up to the paternalistic ideals, the enslaved people he owned could not leave his property without his consent, had no access to education, and worked along long hours with no pay. Well, at least here, now they're giving you access to education. Access to education is getting you indebted and things like that, but at least you have that. The long hours with no pay, you even have some jobs are not really being built, not really existing because of certain systems, certain protections to certain jobs that should be actually, some industries that should not be existing that kind of way, certain ideals and things, inflation of money that's keeping older people in certain jobs and then not passing on the jobs to the new people, certain markets not being allowed to grow, certain markets not being allowed to die off, and then those resources being redistributed in a more productive way to actual means that can use it in a better way and employ people in a better way. The schooling indoctrination complex is keeping people on ways that are adjusted. You know how they say, due to the system of the military? Those ibises are so annoying. You can hear them. But let's pause it. Oh, they're gone. So due to the system of the way the military is, you're always fighting the last war. That's a regular thing said with the military. But then when you're fighting illiteracy, when you're doing the things in the welfare state, you're also fighting the last issues, the last social issues that people had. It's not really adjusted to it. So I paused. Went and yelled expletives I threatened that bird I was going to throw rocks at. Don't even have rocks up here to throw at them. But yeah, such loud birds. Okay, so yeah, it's not the bird's fault. I should have prepared better, maybe close the windows in case that happened. But it's a nice sunny day out. But back to this. The state is not responsive to the actual society. It always comes behind things. They're following behind things. Even these changes happen due to the populist changing and then the parties switch platforms slowly but surely. Right now we have regressives in the United States of America trying to tell us that woke one was a thing of the past and they're trying to pivot. They're trying to switch oh my God, woke one was so crazy. It was during the pandemic, so there was all this things going on. The conditions were crazy, and people were saying all these wild things. We didn't really mean some of those things. People were scared, and we had to just try our best. And no. Tell me the specific things about it that you're saying are crazy. That's not really mentioned. Tell me why those things are crazy and why you'd never support those things again. Even if you're just lying, and then you'll get in and support them again. At least do the basic amount of just explaining some of these things. But do they need to do that anymore, or do people just vote for them anyway? Even look at the thing, right now with the warfare state, with this Iran expedition that the Trump administration got in. They didn't even attempt. At least back in Bush times, in the Iraq War, there was weapons of mass destruction. There was more of those things. But right now, it's like Iran can't have nukes. Now they're not even talking about that anymore. Now it's like the Hormuz Strait needs to be open. Like it was already open before. So why was all Iran can't have nukes? They don't even explain. They don't even pitch. They don't even try to sell you this stuff anymore. People just do it. They understand you can just kind of like massage certain things, and you can use all these polling and these tactics to just get enough votes in this area. And then since there's enough of concentration of people in this one area, once you get through the primary, then all of a sudden you're going to be okay and you shoe in for this place. And every election, it's only like 5 to 10 states that are really up for grabs. And then when you go to the smaller levels as well, for the seats, we're only talking about every time you come around in these midterm 2-year elections for Senate, for the Congress representatives, and then the 6-year ones for the Senate. There's always only like, okay, there's 100 senators and then 500 and something representatives. Now you have maybe like, realistically, 10 Senate seats that'd be high. That'd be a high time when you're like, oh wow, of the third going, there's up to like 5 or 6 people that you actually switch in this kind of way. But we know this is a solid Democrat. We know this is a solid Republican. And the same thing with the House of Representatives. It's normally like 30 seats at most every 2 years are actually where you can say there's a chance these people are going to slide in this way and slide in that way. And that's just like an absurd system going on. Okay, so back to the reading here. As is often the case with enslaved families, the individuals we know the most about are those who worked closely with the president and thus appear in the written records created by Jackson and his family members. George, an enslaved man and son of longtime Hermitage cook Ald Hannah, served as Jackson's manservant. He was in his early 20s when Jackson brought him to the White House. He slept in the president's bedroom on a pallet next to his bed, so that he was accessible anytime Jackson needed him. A manservant was always on call, with no real time off. George remained at the president's side for decades, whether he wanted to or not. When Jackson died in 1845, George was standing next to his sickbed. So now this is the kind of stuff where when people say, okay, the Black Americans built America and stuff like that, or slavery built America, in this kind of aspect, I can kind of see where that has some sense. If you can say Andrew Jackson built America, and you can say, okay, when you have a wife, they help you and support you. Yes, his wife died, but you can have other people and other family members support the person who's actually doing most of the direct building. A manservant is somebody who's directly helping you, assisting you to do many things and have the energy and time and capacity, frees you up from doing other daily basic functions in order for you to do whatever it is that comes to like the physical actual building of the United States of America. So maybe a slave also helped build the Democratic Party. A slave helped establish the Democratic Party. That can be part of that. I can kind of understand how you could say George also was a co-setter for them, because you're saying Van Buren and all these people kind of quoted and put it in, but while Jackson was writing and thinking and talking and politicking, George was standing right next to him, was handling things that Jackson might have to do by himself if he wasn't for George, wasn't for slavery. Okay. George had no immediate family of his own when he came to the White House, but others were separated from their family members. Charles was a carriage driver and had been Andrew Jackson's manservant during his military campaigns. He spent some portion of the Jackson presidency at the White House, but his wife Charlotte and their 3 young children remained at the Hermitage. Jackson trusted Charles enough to use him as a courier, so he may have occasionally seen his family when transporting messages and goods between Washington and Tennessee, but they were mostly separated for years. And then here you have a picture. Although contemporary accounts suggest that George was at Andrew Jackson's side when he died, this courier and eyes painting and other popular depictions of the president's deathbed leave him out. Yeah, so that one, again, that's part of that mythologizing of history. But then, since it's a post-myth nation, there's accounts, the stories that are trustworthy enough to say that some of these things were not there. But then if you had this in the typical sort of place, they're just like, no, it was just this angelic with the family and kind of situation. But yeah, okay, back to the reading. The separation seems to have strained the relationship between Charles and Charlotte. Our best evidence is that their lives comes from Jackson's correspondence with a potential buyer for Charlotte and the 3 children. Yeah. In November 1830, he wrote 2 letters to Robert Johnston Chester, offering Charlotte and the 3 children to him for $800. Jackson wrote that Charlotte was specifically asked to be sold to Chester. Being discontented where she is now, Jackson emphasized how this sale would be in the best interest of the enslaved people involved. Again, for the greater good, for your greater good. I'm not doing this for me, I'm doing it for you. He had only purchased Charlotte in the first place, he wrote, because Charles had asked him to, and he was only willing to sell her now because Charles had agreed to it. I did not wish to separate her and her children from Charles, particularly his children. Jackson wrote, ignoring the reality that he had already separated them by bringing Charles to Washington, D.C., and leaving the rest of the family in Tennessee. Jackson had every intention of sending Charles home until he heard of this request. I inquired of Charles whether he was contented to part with her and the children. He replied in the affirmative. Like, was he actually like daft enough to like? That's the context thing. Like, he actually considered that to be affirmative consent in that dynamic, in that situation. That's kind of wild. I mean, I'm not saying like Charles may have had access to other people at that point in time, and he may have just preferred his life and seen the potential of things, and maybe it wasn't that copacetic of a relationship to begin with. But come on, like, why is that even mentioned? Anyway, the sale, however, likely never happened. Charlotte and her children appear in Hermitage records in the 1840s and 1850s, long past the date of this proposed transaction. With no direct record of Charles's and Charlotte's perspectives, we have to rely on Jackson's letters to speculate how they felt about the entire situation and what might have changed. Maybe the relationship had ended and Charlotte had asked Jackson to sell her to Chester, but then had a change of heart. Perhaps the extended separation put such a strain on the marriage that Charles would willingly leave his wife, but he balked at the idea of abandoning 3 children under the age of 7. Or maybe Jackson and Chester simply could not agree on a price for the woman, who Jackson called one of the best servants I ever saw, were it not for her ungovernable temper and tongue. This is the trope of like, I mean, well, she has complete reason. You know, the trope of like the angry black woman who speaks back. If this is your situation, you have all the right to talk back. You're enslaved. Come on, just trying to sell you and your kids out. Like, come on, dude. Like, it's absurd. Anyway, so whatever the truth might be in this case, it appears that Charles's family was spared the permanent separation that a sale would have created. Other members of Andrew Jackson's household were not so fortunate. In fact, several members of Jackson's enslaved staff came into the White House through purchase, rather than traveling from Tennessee. Historian William Seal argued that Jackson increased the number of enslaved people and decreased the number of free hired servants in his household over the course of his presidency to save money. So he may have viewed the purchase of additional enslaved laborers as a cost-cutting measure. It was a greater investment upfront than hired labor, but it yielded a lifetime of labor for the president. And here's an excerpt from Andrew Jackson's book on April 16th, 1832, showing a check to his adopted nephew, Major A.J. Donaldson, for a mulatto girl slave, bought by him for Andrew Jackson. I don't know, I might try to do an accent here. A mulatto girl slave bought by him for Andrew Jackson, which he has given to Mary Rachel, daughter of A.J. and Emily Donaldson. In late 1931, Jackson purchased a servant boy named Adam from Colonel John Gibbon Stewart of Virginia. Adam worked in the White House for at least a year and maybe longer. Another enslaved child, an 8-year-old girl named Emmeline, came into the White House early in 1832. She was purchased as a gift for Mary Emily Donaldson, Jackson's grandniece, by his nephew, Major Andrew Jackson Donaldson. Donaldson made the purchase on the president's behalf, and Jackson reimbursed him for the girl afterwards. Again, 10% for the big guy is a lot less an issue than 8-year-old girl for the big guy. It's a lot less an issue what Trump is doing with Bitcoin, with his sons. And okay, now it's arguable that you're investing in drone things and are going out and actually bombing people because the U.S. gives a contract to the drone company. Allegedly. Of course, allegedly. And if your father-in-law is purchasing the LA Lakers 2 years after it was sold for $10 billion, for $12 billion, because of certain investigations and the machinations of the billionaire that actually bought the team before, and having some kind of pass on that. Maybe we'll see if the investigations will be dropped by the current administration. Allegedly, again, allegedly. But all that stuff, I think, still pales in comparison to people who are buying slaves for each other. Wild stuff. What is $800? Let me double check. Let me pause a bit. Based on the available data for $800 adjusted for US inflation to 2026, here are the equivalent values of the years starting with 1830. So from 1830, $800 is equivalent to, how much do you think it is, first of all? Like, let me give you some time to think about it. Put up a number. It's $28,958.26. A cumulative increase of 3,519.78% of inflation because of what these people are doing to the currency. Is absurd. But then also, still, like 28,000, you can get like. What's the minimum? So I did another search. Household income, according to 2024 data, 7.1% of households earn under $15,000. 6.4% earn between $15,000 and $24,000. Combined, approximately 13.5% of households in the United States earn less than $25,000. An additional 6.8% earn between $25,000 and $34,000. And then it said low income threshold, approximately 50 million Americans, 15% of the population have household incomes under 34,000. And they said individual income data suggested about 21% of Americans working 30 or more hours a year earned less than $30,000 in 2022. So yeah, that's like how much you're actually buying an entire human being for in 1830. That's stuff going back in history is like, man, history was grimy. Like, there's no one in history that looks good compared to today, which is a positive thing because that just shows that we're improving steadily. And there's things we're doing today that we're like, okay, we're great. That in like 100 years, 1,000 years, 100 years, people are going to be like, oh, what were these people? You were doing what? What were you guys doing on a regular basis? You were doing what? But yeah, that's the way. I mean, that's where actual progress happens. Genuine human flourishing increases, and things like that happen. Okay, so back to the reading. Mary Emily lived in the White House with her father, who served as the president's private secretary, along with many members of her extended family. Emmeline, on the other hand, probably never lived with her family again. The president relied heavily on his family members to help run the White House. In addition to Major Donaldson acting as his private secretary, his niece Emily Donaldson and daughter-in-law Sarah York Jackson served as White House hostesses. With such an extensive household full of relatives, Jackson needed a large domestic staff. While in D.C., he purchased Gracie Bradley and her sister Louisa to help fill this need. Gracie was a skilled seamstress and also acted as Sarah York Jackson's lady maid. Louisa became a nurse for Jackson's grandchildren. Now, as an image, excerpt from Andrew Jackson's bank book for March 23rd, 1832, showing a check for $400 to son of Negro girl Grace. To son for, it's like better, like, okay, he paid someone? I was like, no, to son for Negro girl Grace. So he paid his, it was like $400. So that's like, what was that? It was something like, if my math is garbage, $1,700 or something like that. Where is the son? Oh, in current money? Oh, wow. What kind of payments has Trump or Hunter or Biden done for been given by their father for the investments that they made on behalf of them? Compared to, oh man. Okay. In addition to running the household and serving the family, Andrew Jackson used enslaved labor to support his favorite hobby, breeding and racing horses. In April 1832, Graves W. Steele, Jackson's Hermitage overseer, wrote to him to tell him that 3 promising colts were ready to travel to Washington, D.C. He dispatched 3 enslaved boys, Byron, Jesse, and Jim, along with horse trainer William Alexander, to bring them to the White House. Byron was 12 years old at the time, and Jim may have been as young as 9. Jesse's age is unknown. Another letter refers to 3 racehorses with 3 race riders sent to D.C., so they may have been sent to serve as jockeys. The matter of transporting these colts to Washington appears several times in Jackson papers, largely because of miscommunication between the White House and the Hermitage. John Eaton, and John Overton, the president's friends, arrived in the Hermitage with their wives the day after Byron, Jesse, Jim, and Alexander set off for the Colts. Eaton and Overton worried that if word got out that the president was racing horses in Washington, every gossip month and newspaper would proclaim on it to injurious effect. Running the horses under Major Donelson's name, as the president planned to do, would not fool anyone. To protect Jackson's reputation, Eaton and Overton decided to send Andrew Jackson Hutchings, Jackson's adopted son, to fetch the party and bring them back to the Hermitage. President Jackson was livid at the delay in executing his orders, although he largely blamed Steele and Hutchins for the decision. He wrote several letters lamenting the astonishing and foolish conduct of his family and servants in Tennessee and demanding the party be sent to D.C. as originally planned. A slow transit of information between D.C. and Tennessee in 1832 delayed the transport of the horses by enslaved workers for several weeks. Excerpt from John Henry Eaton's April 16, 1932 letter to Andrew Jackson, where he notes that the 3 racehorses and 3 riders have been recalled to the Hermitage. See, here now again, like I'm saying, it's the travel, the amount of them to get there, but now you just go on your phone and you just put some zeros and ones into something and zeros and ones and that kind of thing is a bit foreshadowing for the next person, place, project that's going to be highlighted in the Made America series. Something that preceded that, led to that. Anyway, so you have this sort of situation where this is happening. People are using their power. Like, I am still a human being. I still have preferences. I still want to do things, even though I am the president, regardless of what it might look to other people. And damn anybody who stands in my way, I'm going to have my way. That's the sort of people that have selected these positions, and that's not going to stop. That's how it wasn't passed. That's how it is today. That's how it will continue to be as long as the state is still constituted in the means that it is. Okay, on June 13th, Jackson finally reported that Byron, Jesse, and Jim had arrived at the White House. The matter seemed to have dropped off the president's radar until their arrival, although in late July he noted in a letter to his son that the Colts and boys are all well and doing well. That update was probably the only news the boys' families received during their time apart, if it was communicated to them at all. We know the 3 young jockeys spent several months at the White House. In November, when the racing season was over, Jackson wrote to his son, Andrew Jackson Jr., that Byron and Jim were on their way home. He instructed his son to take Byron in the house and learn him neatness and industry, training him for future household service. The third enslaved youth, Jesse, is not mentioned in this letter. It's unclear whether he was sent home or remained at the White House. And now here, President Jackson was an avid horseman, so horses are shown in 19th century print that would primarily have been cared for and ridden by enslaved people. And they just have a picture of the plantation home there. Jesse's disappearance from the record is unfortunately not unique. There is so much we don't know about the lives of the enslaved White House staff under Andrew Jackson. In 1829, Hermitage and slave inventory was the last one. In 1829, Hermitage slave inventory was the last one Jackson completed. And it says nothing about each person's work assignment or who might have been brought to the White House. We have been able to recover the names, occupations, and experiences of a handful of enslaved people from President Jackson's papers and other contemporary sources, but much of the history is still missing. The University of Tennessee, Knoxville is working to publish all of Jackson's papers, and current volumes only extend through 1832, less than halfway through Jackson's presidency. As new volumes are published, we hope to learn more about the enslaved individuals who worked within the White House during this time. So thank you to Dr. Daniel Feller, Director of the Papers of Andrew Jackson, and Marcia Mullen, VP Museum Services and Chief Curator of Andrew Jackson's Hermitage, for the contributions to this article. So now, if you are of the sort to say, if something was started by a slave owner, if something has the name of a slave owner, if something contributes in X, Z, Y way by somebody who owns slaves, we should no longer be a part of that, we should no longer participate, we should no longer patronize that sort of thing. The Democratic Party, no black people should be in there. Yet it's one of the most solid voting bases, not just the United States of America, I think anywhere, to just count for like black women. It's not like 95% voting for Democrats. And that's a party that was started. Yes, the party switched sides. So is it now what Jackson started is actually what the Republican Party is now? Is that what people might think? Or do people just need to drop that sort of thing and just say like, no, some of these things changed. Some of these people were bad people, but some of the things they did might have been positive. Don't pass that on to them. Don't inherit that filth. You can separate that, you can change that, you can go to the future in better ways because we know better now. We are in different circumstances now. Give the people the chance who might have inherited directly certain bad habits and bad things. But if they have more information, like people going in and looking and changing and saying these are different things, we can do this in a different way. We can change some of those things. But then now, even if you go further, now you say, okay, if you're going to keep that inheritance thing, but you also say black people built this, then if there's anything negative that Andrew Jackson did, and you're saying that is a reason to not have Andrew Jackson's name up, but if that thing that Andrew Jackson did was in part also done because of George's support, then are you saying let's stick in the Democratic Party because it was created by somebody who had a manservant and slave, and then that black person was the person who actually invented it, so maybe let's use the thing that this black slave created, helped create, in order to like free black people now, even though right now some of the policies are kind of putting people back on that Democrat plantation. So I don't know, but this is this part of why I've had an interest in this history, sociology, especially United States of America, from having lived there, from having interest in that, from seeing how much other places in the world actually try to duplicate and do things like America, and how Americans themselves are trying to do things like what they think America can be or is, and just trying to parse those things out. So I think that's it for now. I'm probably going to check out right now Made America 250 series. There's merchandise on the screen as you were seeing the speed drawing going on. You can check that out on the Redbubble store. There's other playlists. Wherever you're listening to this, you probably find a link to the playlist on rantathon.wordpress.com. You can find it there. Dying Alive on Odyssey, BitChute, Rumble, and YouTube, of course. You can find the videos there of the other people that have been on there. I will keep doing this for 25 weeks until we go through every year of the decade. Like, share, subscribe. If you like the series, you can suggest other people that should be in this. I might even go back and add people in the past, the people that I missed, places, projects that I missed. But I'm doing it at least for these 25 weeks, and I'll see. So it'd be at least 25 people. I already threw Fauci in there, so it's going to be at least 26 people now. No, yeah, no, it's 206. Yeah, it's 250. So at least 25 people. Now it's at least 26. So we can be adding other people and plugging other people in this project. And I'll probably continue it past the 25 weeks. But I'll do at least 25 weeks. Every week you'll be getting one or more people in order to just have this series going up, as I also look through the United States of America's history and understand my fascination with what it is more, and try to understand what Americans define America as, what other people define America as, and more importantly, what I define the United States of America as, and what made it that thing, and what can make it potentially great in the future. So that's it for me. Blah, blah, blah. That's it for me for now. Ladies, gentlemen, and everybody else in between, goodbye.